The funniest thing about being underestimated is that the people laughing the loudest rarely realize they are standing in front of a future they cannot imagine. I learned that lesson sitting around my parents' dining room table on a warm Saturday evening in late spring. The occasion was my mother's 65th birthday, one of those family gatherings where everyone arrived carrying desserts, stories, and opinions that nobody had asked for. My sister and her husband were already there when I arrived, along with a few aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not seen in several months. The house smelled like roasted chicken, fresh rolls, and the apple pie my mother insisted on baking herself every year. Everything looked exactly the way it always had, from the family photographs lining the hallway to the old grandfather clock that had been ticking in the corner since I was a child. I parked my 8-year-old pickup truck in front of the house, straightened my button-down shirt, picked up the birthday gift I had wrapped the night before, and walked toward the front door. My father, Richard Brooks, opened it before I even reached the porch. "There he is," he said with a grin. "Still driving that old truck, I see." I smiled. "It still gets me where I need to go." He laughed as if I had confirmed something he already believed. "One of these days you are going to realize success is supposed to look successful." I simply nodded and stepped inside. I had heard versions of that sentence for years. My mother hugged me tightly, thanked me for coming early, and immediately asked if I could help carry drinks to the dining room. That was one thing I always appreciated about her. No matter how many opinions filled the house, she always made everyone feel welcome first. Within half an hour, the entire family had gathered around the large dining table. Conversation flowed easily from sports to vacations, from rising grocery prices to home improvement projects. Eventually, just as I expected, someone asked me the question that always seemed to appear at family gatherings. "So, Ethan," my uncle said while pouring himself another glass of iced tea, "how is your little software business doing these days?" Before I could answer, my father chuckled. Little is exactly the right word. A few people laughed politely. I smiled and answered anyway. "Business is going well. We have been busy." My father leaned back in his chair. "Busy doing what?" he asked. "You never talk about clients. You never talk about revenue. You still rent that modest office downtown. You have, what, maybe a dozen employees?" 12, I answered calmly. "See," he said, looking around the table. "I keep telling him that if he got a real corporate job, he could probably be making twice as much by now. Instead, he keeps chasing this tiny company." My sister looked uncomfortable but remained silent. One of my cousins shrugged and said, "At least he enjoys what he does." My father smiled politely before shaking his head. "Enjoyment is wonderful, but eventually people have to build something valuable." He looked directly at me. "Tell me honestly, Ethan, has anyone ever even offered to buy that business of yours?" A few relatives laughed again. None of them meant to be cruel. They simply trusted my father's judgment because he had spent 40 years building a successful building supply company from the ground up. In their minds, experience gave him authority. I cut another piece of chicken before answering. No serious discussions worth talking about. Technically, that statement was still true because nothing had been finalized. My father nodded as though I had confirmed his entire argument. "Exactly," he said. "Nobody is going to spend real money buying a tiny company that hardly anyone has heard of." The words hung over the table for a moment before conversation slowly shifted toward another subject. I did not argue. There was no point. I had learned years earlier that people rarely changed their minds because of explanations. They changed because reality eventually became impossible to ignore. After dinner, my mother asked me to help carry empty dishes into the kitchen. While washing a few plates, she smiled apologetically. "You know your father worries about you," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "He wants you to have security." I dried another plate before placing it into the cabinet. "I understand." She studied my face for a moment. "Does it bother you when he talks like that?" I smiled gently. "Not anymore." That answer surprised even me because it had not always been true. Years earlier, I had spent countless nights wondering whether he might actually be right. Maybe my company was too small. Maybe I should accept one of the executive positions larger firms had offered over the years. Maybe I should chase titles instead of building something quietly on my own terms. But every time I imagined walking away from the company I had spent nearly a decade creating, the decision felt wrong. Success had never meant having the biggest office or the newest luxury vehicle. Success meant waking up excited to solve meaningful problems with people I respected. It meant building trust slowly instead of chasing attention quickly. Most importantly, it meant sleeping peacefully because I never had to pretend to be someone else. Before leaving, I hugged my mother goodbye and shook my father's hand. He smiled as he walked me toward the driveway. "Son," he said, "there is still time to sell that little company and find something bigger." I looked at him, smiled politely, and climbed into my truck. As I started the engine, my phone vibrated on the passenger seat. A new email notification appeared on the screen. The sender was one of the largest technology companies in the country, and the subject line contained only 6 words that would have sounded unbelievable to everyone sitting inside that house. "We want to discuss an acquisition." I did not open the email until I reached my townhouse a few minutes later. I had learned long ago that important decisions deserved a clear mind instead of a quick reaction in a parking lot. After setting my laptop on the kitchen table, I read the message carefully from beginning to end. It came from the corporate development division of Atlas Dynamics, one of the largest technology companies in the country. The email was professional, direct, and surprisingly brief. They explained that they had spent several months studying software companies whose products solved a specific problem in enterprise operations. My company had consistently appeared at the top of their internal research. They were interested in discussing a possible acquisition if I was willing to have a confidential conversation. I read the email twice before closing my laptop. Most people would probably have celebrated immediately. Instead, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat quietly by the living room window. Excitement could become dangerous if it arrived too early. An email was not an agreement. It was simply an opportunity. My company had been built on patience, and I intended to approach this conversation the same way. Early Monday morning, I drove to the office just as I always did. The building looked exactly as it had every other weekday for years. It occupied the second floor of a modest brick office complex a few miles from downtown. There was no oversized company logo, no marble lobby, and no expensive artwork decorating the entrance. People who walked past the building would never guess that businesses from across the country quietly relied on the software my team created every day. I unlocked the front door a little before 8 o'clock. Rachel, my operations manager, arrived only a few minutes later carrying her usual travel mug of coffee. She smiled as she noticed me already reviewing emails. "You are here early," she said. "Could not sleep." I smiled. "Something interesting arrived last night." She immediately recognized the expression on my face. We had worked together for nearly 7 years, and she knew the difference between ordinary news and something worth paying attention to. I handed her a printed copy of the email. She read it silently before looking back at me with raised eyebrows. "Atlas Dynamics?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "They want to talk." Rachel sat down across from my desk without saying anything for several seconds. Finally, she smiled. "I knew this day would eventually come," she said. I laughed softly. "You sound more confident than I feel." "That is because I have watched this company grow from 4 people sharing one room into 12 people serving clients across the country," she replied. "Other companies notice things like that. Our business had never followed the path most technology startups preferred. We had never chased investors. We had never appeared in magazines celebrating fast growth. We had never tried to become the loudest company in the industry. Instead, we focused on solving complicated problems for organizations that valued reliability over publicity. Every new client arrived because another satisfied client recommended us. Growth happened slowly, but every step rested on trust instead of hype. That philosophy sometimes confused people outside the business world, especially my father. He measured success through visible signs. A larger office meant a better company. A luxury vehicle meant higher income. More employees meant greater importance. My company rarely fit those assumptions because I believed unnecessary spending often distracted from meaningful progress. We invested in better software, stronger security, employee development, and customer support long before we considered expensive furniture or impressive decorations. Around mid-morning, I gathered everyone in the conference room. The team expected another routine project update, but I believed they deserved honesty. "I have something confidential to share," I began. "Yesterday evening we received an email from Atlas Dynamics requesting a conversation about a possible acquisition." The room became completely silent. A few people exchanged surprised looks while others simply stared at me. Finally, one of our senior engineers asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. "Does that mean you are planning to sell the company?" I shook my head. It means someone wants to have a conversation. Nothing more. I explained that any future discussions would remain confidential unless something significant developed. I also promised that our daily work would continue exactly as before because every existing client deserved the same attention they had always received. By the end of the meeting, everyone appeared calmer. They understood that speculation accomplished nothing. Consistent work remained our greatest priority. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller introduced herself as Laura Bennett, Vice President of Corporate Development at Atlas Dynamics. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who negotiated important agreements every week. After exchanging introductions, she thanked me for responding so quickly to their email. She explained that her team had been studying our company for almost 9 months. They admired the stability of our client relationships, the quality of our software, and the unusually high retention of both customers and employees. Those qualities, she explained, had become increasingly rare within the technology industry. We would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you in person, she said. Our goal is simply to begin a conversation and better understand whether our long-term visions might align. I agreed to a private meeting later that week at our office. Before ending the call, Laura added one final sentence that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Mr. Brooks, we are not interested in buying numbers on a spreadsheet. We are interested in acquiring the people and principles that created those numbers. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair and looked through the conference room window where my team continued working as though it were any other Tuesday. None of them realized that one phone call had quietly opened the door to a future capable of changing every one of our lives. Yet outside our office, my father was probably still telling someone that nobody would ever want to buy a company as small as mine. Thursday arrived with the same quiet routine that had guided my business for years. I unlocked the office before sunrise, reviewed the agenda for the day, and spent an hour answering client emails before anyone else arrived. The meeting with Atlas Dynamics was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but I wanted enough time to organize every document they had requested in advance. Financial summaries, customer retention reports, product roadmaps, and security certifications were neatly arranged inside labeled folders on the conference room table. Nothing had been exaggerated or polished to create a better impression. I believed that if another company wanted to understand who we truly were, they deserved to see reality instead of a carefully manufactured presentation. Rachel arrived shortly after 8, carrying her usual notebook and a fresh cup of coffee. She glanced into the conference room before smiling. "Everything looks ready," she said. "As ready as it can be," I answered. She sat across from my desk and looked at me for a moment. "Are you nervous?" she asked. I considered the question honestly before replying. "Not nervous," I said. "Curious." She laughed softly. That is probably the calmest answer anyone has ever given before a meeting like this. I smiled because excitement had never helped me make better decisions. My responsibility extended beyond myself. 12 employees trusted this company to support their families, and dozens of clients relied on our software every single day. Any decision involving the future of the business had to protect those relationships first. A few minutes before 10, 3 visitors stepped out of the elevator. Rachel greeted them warmly before leading them into the conference room. Laura Bennett introduced the other 2 members of her team, one from corporate strategy and the other from finance. Their professionalism immediately stood out. There were no dramatic speeches or exaggerated promises. Instead, they thanked us for welcoming them and explained that the purpose of the meeting was simply to learn more about the company behind the product they had been studying for months. We spent the first hour discussing our history. I explained how the business had started in a rented workspace with only 4 employees and a simple goal of building dependable software that solved problems instead of creating unnecessary complexity. We had intentionally avoided rapid expansion because we believed sustainable growth protected both employees and customers. Every new feature was tested carefully before release. Every client relationship received personal attention regardless of contract size. Laura listened carefully, occasionally making notes, but interrupting only to ask thoughtful questions. She seemed less interested in financial projections than in understanding why our culture remained so consistent despite steady growth. During a short coffee break, she walked beside me toward the reception area. "Can I ask you something that is not on our agenda?" she said. "Of course," I replied. She looked around the office before speaking. Most founders who reach your level have already moved into a much larger headquarters. Why have you stayed here? I smiled because I had heard similar questions before. This office still gives us everything we need. The money we saved by not moving into a luxury building helped us hire better engineers, improve customer support, and strengthen our products. Our clients pay us to solve their problems, not to impress them with expensive furniture. Laura nodded slowly. That answer explains many things we discovered during our research. When everyone returned to the conference room, the discussion became more detailed. Their finance director reviewed several reports before complimenting the stability of our business. Unlike many technology companies, we had very little customer turnover, almost no employee departures, and predictable long-term revenue. They explained that those characteristics were far more valuable than dramatic but unstable growth. Around lunchtime, Laura closed her notebook and folded her hands together. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I think it is important that we clarify why we are here today." The room became completely quiet. "We are not here to discuss a partnership agreement or a consulting contract. Atlas Dynamics would like to acquire your company." Although I had expected those words, hearing them spoken aloud still carried weight. She continued calmly. "Our board believes your technology fits perfectly within our long-term strategy. More importantly, we believe your leadership team has built something that cannot easily be replicated. We are interested in preserving what makes this company successful rather than replacing it." I thanked her for the honesty and asked several questions about their intentions regarding employees, product development, and customer relationships. Every answer emphasized continuity instead of disruption. Before the meeting ended, Laura handed me a confidential folder. Inside was a formal letter of intent outlining the framework of a potential acquisition. The document included confidentiality requirements and an exclusivity period if I chose to proceed with further negotiations. She made it very clear that nothing required an immediate decision. "Take your time," she said. "We have spent months preparing for this conversation. We would rather wait a little longer than rush an agreement that deserves careful consideration." After shaking hands, the three visitors left as professionally as they had arrived. Rachel quietly closed the conference room door before turning toward me. "Well?" she asked with a smile. I looked down at the folder resting on the table. "This is only the beginning," I answered. "Now we have to decide whether selling the company is actually the right decision." She nodded because she understood exactly what I meant. The value of the business had never been measured only by numbers. It represented years of trust, friendships, and shared purpose. As I placed the confidential documents inside my desk drawer, my phone vibrated with a new text message from my father. He wanted to know whether I planned to attend another family barbecue that weekend. I smiled quietly because he still believed my biggest concern was keeping a struggling little business alive, completely unaware that one of the largest technology companies in America had just asked to buy it. The family barbecue took place that Saturday afternoon in my parents' backyard, exactly where dozens of birthdays, graduation parties, and holiday gatherings had been held over the years. My father stood beside the grill wearing his favorite baseball cap, while talking with neighbors who had stopped by to say hello. Children ran across the freshly cut lawn chasing each other with plastic water guns, and my mother arranged bowls of potato salad and fresh fruit across the picnic table. It looked like another ordinary weekend, and I intended to keep it that way. The confidential meeting with Atlas Dynamics remained exactly that, confidential. I had signed the agreement, and even if I had not, I believed that important business discussions belonged inside the company until real decisions had been made. As soon as I stepped into the backyard, my father waved me over. "Ethan," he called out with a smile. "Come meet Jim. He retired from one of the largest manufacturing companies in the state." Jim shook my hand warmly before asking the question I had begun to expect from almost everyone I met. "So what do you do?" Before I could answer, my father spoke for me. "He owns a little software company downtown. Keeps himself busy." I smiled politely. "That is one way to describe it." Jim nodded. "Technology is changing fast. Must be competitive. It keeps us focused," I replied. Before the conversation could continue, my father laughed and added, "I keep telling him that one day he should sell the business and finally do something bigger." Jim smiled politely, but wisely avoided taking sides. He simply wished me luck and walked toward another group of guests. My father looked at me as though he had offered valuable advice. "You know I only want the best for you. he said. I know, I answered. Then listen to me. Small businesses disappear every day. If someone ever offered you a fair price, you should take it before it is too late. I almost smiled at the timing of his words. If only he knew that someone already had. Instead, I simply replied, I appreciate the concern. He shook his head. You always say that, but you never tell me what your long-term plan is. I have one, I answered calmly. I just do not think every plan needs to be announced before it happens. He looked unconvinced, but before he could continue, my mother called everyone over for lunch. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as plates were filled and drinks were passed around the table. My sister eventually mentioned that she and her husband were thinking about buying a larger house. Everyone congratulated them. My father proudly explained how responsible financial planning had helped them qualify for a better mortgage. Then he looked toward me again. What about you? He asked. Still in the townhouse? Yes, I answered. It still works well for me. You could probably afford something nicer if that company ever took off, he said. A few relatives laughed quietly. I simply smiled and continued eating. Years earlier, those comments would have bothered me. I would have felt an urge to defend every decision I had made. Now I understood that silence often carried more confidence than arguments. People who truly believed in themselves rarely needed to convince everyone else. After lunch, my cousin Mark walked over while I was helping fold a few lawn chairs. Can I ask you something? He said quietly. Sure. He lowered his voice. Does it bother you when Uncle Richard jokes about your business? I looked toward my father, who was happily talking with friends near the grill. Not really, I answered honestly. He judges success by what he understands. I judge it differently. Mark nodded. For what it is worth, I think it is impressive that you built something yourself. Thank you, I replied. That means a lot. Later that afternoon, I received an email notification on my phone. It was from Laura Bennett confirming that Atlas Dynamics wanted to move into the next phase of discussions. Their legal team requested access to additional financial information so they could begin formal due diligence if I agreed. I read the message once before locking my phone and placing it back into my pocket. At that exact moment, my father walked over carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to me before sitting beside me on the patio. You know, he said after a long pause, I worry because I spent my whole life building something solid. I just want to know you have that same security. I appreciated the sincerity behind his words. He was not trying to hurt me. He simply believed that visible size and stability were the same thing. I understand, I said, and I am grateful that you care. He nodded. Promise me one thing. What is that? If somebody ever gives you the chance to sell that business for a decent amount of money, do not let your pride get in the way. Sometimes the smartest move is knowing when to walk away. I smiled because his advice was genuine, even if it was based on assumptions that no longer matched reality. I will remember that, I replied. As the afternoon came to an end, I hugged my mother goodbye and drove home with the windows down, thinking about everything my father had said. By Monday morning, my attorneys would begin reviewing confidentiality documents, accountants would prepare secure financial records, and one of the largest technology companies in America would begin examining every detail of the business my father still believed was too small for anyone to notice. Monday morning marked the beginning of a process that very few people outside the business world ever get to see. Movies often made acquisitions look dramatic, with executives shaking hands over enormous contracts and celebrating in luxurious boardrooms. But reality moved much more quietly. It began with secure data rooms, detailed financial records, legal reviews, technical audits, and dozens of questions that required precise answers. By 8 o'clock, Rachel and I were sitting in the conference room with our outside attorney, Daniel Mercer, and our accounting firm connected through a video call. Every document that Atlas Dynamics had requested was organized into encrypted folders. Revenue reports, tax filings, software architecture summaries, customer retention metrics, employment agreements, intellectual property registrations, and compliance certifications were all prepared exactly as they had existed before anyone expressed interest in acquiring the company. I had no interest in decorating reality. If our business was truly valuable, it would withstand careful examination exactly as it was. Daniel reviewed the confidentiality provisions one final time before looking at me. From this point forward, he said, assume every major decision is part of due diligence. Continue operating normally. Do not make unusual purchases. Do not sign long-term commitments without discussing them first. Most importantly, keep leading the company the same way that attracted their attention in the first place. I appreciated that advice because it reflected exactly how I already intended to approach the situation. Nothing about our daily operations changed. Developers continued improving our software. Customer support answered every call with the same patience they always had. Weekly planning meetings remained focused on product quality instead of speculation. I reminded everyone that regardless of what happened in the coming weeks, our responsibility to clients had not changed. If an acquisition eventually occurred, it would happen because of the consistency we demonstrated now, not because we became distracted by possibilities. Throughout the week, requests from Atlas Dynamics arrived steadily but respectfully. Their finance team wanted clarification regarding long-term subscription agreements. Their legal department requested additional documentation concerning software licensing. Their cybersecurity specialists scheduled technical reviews with our engineering team. Every conversation reinforced the same impression. They were not searching for weaknesses to exploit. They were trying to understand why a relatively small company consistently outperformed competitors many times its size. Rachel noticed the pattern before I mentioned it. As we finished another conference call, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Have you realized something?" she asked. "What is that?" I replied. "Almost every question they ask is about our people, our culture, or how we make decisions. Very few questions are only about money." She was right. During one meeting, an executive had spent nearly 30 minutes asking how we trained new employees and why so many team members had remained with the company for years. Another wanted to understand why clients renewed contracts at such unusually high rates. Those conversations reminded me that businesses were ultimately built on trust, not spreadsheets. Numbers could describe performance, but they could not fully explain character. Late Wednesday afternoon, I received another call from Laura Bennett. She thanked me for how organized the entire process had been and mentioned that their internal review was progressing ahead of schedule. Before ending the conversation, she asked whether I would be available for a meeting with additional senior leadership the following week. I agreed without hesitation, although I understood what that request suggested. The higher the level of executives becoming involved, the more serious their interest had become. After work that evening, I stopped by my parents' house to help my father move several heavy storage boxes from the garage into the basement. He had called earlier that day asking whether I had an hour to spare. Despite our different perspectives on business, I had never hesitated to help him whenever he asked. We worked side by side for nearly 45 minutes before taking a short break on the back porch. My father handed me a bottle of water and looked at me thoughtfully. "You have been busy lately," he said. "I tried calling yesterday, but you sounded distracted." I smiled. "Work has been keeping me occupied." He nodded knowingly. "Still chasing new clients?" "Something like that," I answered. He laughed quietly. "I still think you work too hard for a company that size." I simply took another drink of water. He continued, "You know, when I owned my building supply business, I always believed that growth should be obvious. Bigger warehouse, bigger staff, bigger trucks. Customers noticed those things." I looked around the backyard where I had spent so much of my childhood. "Sometimes they do," I replied. "Sometimes they notice other things." He gave me a curious look. "Like what?" I answered honestly. "Reliability, integrity, keeping promises, solving problems better than everyone else." He smiled politely but remained unconvinced. "Those are important too, but eventually success has to become visible." I almost told him everything right then. I imagined explaining the due diligence process, the executive meetings, and the confidential negotiations already underway. For just a moment, I pictured the surprise on his face. But I stopped myself because nothing had actually been decided yet. Celebrating possibilities before they became reality had never matched my personality. Instead, I simply smiled and helped him carry the last few boxes downstairs. As I drove home later that evening, my phone displayed a new calendar invitation from Atlas Dynamics. The meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday would include not only Laura Bennett and her acquisition team, but also the company's chief executive officer, a development that made it increasingly clear this conversation was becoming much larger than anyone outside my office could possibly imagine. Tuesday morning arrived with an unusual sense of calm. After weeks of confidential conversations, document reviews, and careful preparation, the next meeting would involve the highest level of leadership at Atlas Dynamics. Even so, I followed exactly the same routine I had followed for years. I unlocked the office just before 7:30, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, reviewed overnight client messages, and spent half an hour discussing software updates with our lead engineer. I believe consistency mattered most on important days. If success required me to abandon the habits that had built the company, then it would not really be success. Around 8:30, Rachel stepped into my office carrying a printed agenda. "Everything is confirmed," she said. "Laura Bennett will arrive at 10 o'clock along with 2 members of the executive team. Their chief executive officer will join shortly afterward." I thanked her before reviewing the schedule one final time. The conference room looked exactly as it always had. The same polished wooden table, the same whiteboard filled with product ideas, the same shelves holding technical manuals instead of awards. Nothing had been redesigned to impress anyone because I wanted our visitors to understand who we truly were. At exactly 10 o'clock, Laura Bennett and her colleagues arrived. After exchanging greetings, we spent nearly an hour reviewing the progress of due diligence. Their legal department had completed its review. Their financial analysts had verified our records. Their cybersecurity specialists had finished evaluating our software infrastructure. Every major question had been answered. Laura smiled as she closed her notebook. "I have to compliment your team," she said. "We rarely see an organization this well prepared." Rachel accepted the compliment with quiet professionalism while I simply thanked her. A few minutes later, the reception phone rang. Rachel answered before turning toward me with a slight smile. "They have arrived," she said. Moments later, the office door opened again. A tall man in his early 60s entered the conference room with an easy confidence that came from decades of leadership rather than ego. Laura introduced him as Michael Donovan, Chief Executive Officer of Atlas Dynamics. He greeted every member of my team individually before taking his seat. What impressed me most was not his title, but his attention. He looked people in the eye, remembered names immediately, and listened carefully before speaking. After a few minutes of conversation, he turned toward me. "Mr. Brooks," he began, "I have personally reviewed everything my team has gathered over the past several months. I wanted to meet you because I believe acquisitions should involve people, not just paperwork." I appreciated that approach. "Thank you for making the trip," I replied. He smiled. "The trip was worthwhile. Companies like yours are uncommon." The conversation quickly moved beyond financial details. Instead of discussing valuation immediately, Michael wanted to understand how decisions were made inside our company. He asked why employees stayed so long, why clients trusted us, and how we maintained consistent quality without becoming a much larger organization. I answered honestly, explaining that every major decision began with one question. Would it improve the experience of our customers without sacrificing the well-being of our employees? If the answer was yes, we moved forward. If the answer was no, we looked for another solution. Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That philosophy explains something we noticed," he said. "Your competitors spend enormous amounts on advertising. You spend almost nothing. Yet your customer retention is among the strongest we have ever analyzed." I smiled. "Satisfied customers usually become the best marketing department a company can have." He laughed softly. "That is exactly what our research suggested." After lunch, Michael requested a tour of the office. There was not much to see compared to the headquarters of a Fortune 500 corporation. We walked through the development area where engineers quietly collaborated on new software features. We visited customer support, where every representative knew clients by name instead of account number. We stopped in the break room, where team members casually discussed weekend plans while sharing homemade cookies someone had brought that morning. Nothing had been staged. It was simply another workday. As we returned toward the conference room, Michael paused and looked around one final time. "This is what we hoped to find," he said. "Culture is difficult to build and almost impossible to purchase after it has been lost." Before the meeting concluded, he looked directly at me. "I would like to be completely transparent," he said. "Atlas Dynamics has evaluated dozens of companies over the past 2 years. Most had impressive technology. Some had larger revenues than yours. A few even had more recognizable brands. We chose to pursue your company because your people created something much more valuable than software. They created trust. That cannot be copied." Hearing those words carried more weight than any number written inside a financial proposal. They confirmed that everything we had intentionally built over the past decade had been noticed for exactly the reasons I had hoped. After shaking hands, Michael thanked everyone once more before leaving with his team. Rachel waited until the elevator doors closed before turning toward me. "I think that went well," she said with an unmistakable smile. I nodded. "So do I." Just as we began gathering documents from the conference room, my phone rang. The caller was my father. "Ethan," he said cheerfully, "I was planning to stop by your office tomorrow afternoon. I need your opinion about replacing the computer in the garage workshop. You will be there, right?" I smiled without realizing how perfectly the timing had aligned. "Yes," I answered. "I will be here." After ending the call, I looked through the conference room window toward the front entrance. For the first time since this entire process had begun, I realized there was a very real possibility that my father might soon witness something capable of changing his opinion forever. The next afternoon began like any other workday. By noon, our development team was reviewing a new software release. Customer support was responding to routine requests, and Rachel was finalizing several reports that needed to be delivered before the end of the week. Nothing inside the office suggested that we had just completed meetings with one of the largest technology companies in the country. I wanted it that way. Businesses earn trust through consistency, not excitement. Around 1:30, my father arrived carrying a cardboard box with an aging desktop computer inside. He smiled as he walked through the front door. "I finally decided to replace that old machine in my workshop," he said. "I figured you could tell me whether anything on it is worth saving." I welcomed him inside and introduced him to several employees as we carried the computer into a small meeting room. He looked around the office with the same expression he always wore whenever he visited. It was clean, organized, and professional, but it lacked the impressive appearance he associated with highly successful companies. He glanced toward the open workspace where engineers quietly collaborated without private offices or expensive furniture. "You still keep things pretty simple around here," he said. I smiled. "Simple has worked well for us." Before I could continue, Rachel stepped into the room. "Ethan," she said politely, "Laura Bennett just called. Their executive team arrived a little earlier than expected. They are downstairs." I nodded. "Please show them in." My father looked confused. "More clients?" he asked. "A business meeting," I answered calmly. "It should not take too long." He offered to wait in the break room while I handled the meeting. A few moments later, Laura entered alongside Michael Donovan and two additional executives from Atlas Dynamics. As soon as Michael saw me, he extended his hand warmly. "Good afternoon, Ethan. Thank you for making time for us again." My father looked toward the group with polite curiosity, but remained seated near the doorway, assuming they were simply another group of corporate visitors. After everyone settled into the conference room, Michael spoke without unnecessary formalities. "Over the past several weeks, our team has completed an extensive evaluation of your company. We have reviewed your financial performance, your technology, your customer relationships, and your organizational culture. I wanted to return personally because I believe conversations of this importance deserve respect." I thanked him before inviting him to continue. Michael opened a folder but barely looked at the documents inside. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Many founders assume acquisitions happen because of revenue," he said. "Others believe they happen because of market share or publicity. In your case, none of those factors brought us here." My father quietly glanced toward me, his attention suddenly more focused than before. Michael continued, "Your software is excellent, but software can eventually be improved or replaced. What cannot easily be recreated is the discipline behind your company. We interviewed customers who have remained with you for years. We reviewed support records that consistently exceeded industry expectations. We studied employee retention that most companies would consider impossible. Everywhere we looked, we found the same pattern. People trust this company because they trust the people leading it." The room became completely quiet. Even Rachel, who already knew much of the process, listened carefully. Michael smiled before adding, "Our board unanimously agreed that if Atlas Dynamics hopes to build the next generation of enterprise software, we do not simply need your products. We need the culture that created them." My father slowly leaned forward in his chair. For the first time since he had arrived, I could see uncertainty replacing confidence on his face. Michael continued explaining that their research team had spent nearly 9 months comparing companies across the country. Some competitors generated higher annual revenue. Others occupied larger headquarters or employed hundreds more people. Yet none demonstrated the combination of customer loyalty, engineering quality, operational discipline, and leadership consistency that they had found inside our office. Those qualities, he said, are extraordinarily difficult to develop. They are the reason we are here today. My father looked around the conference room as though seeing it for the first time. The plain walls, the ordinary furniture, the modest office that had always seemed too small in his eyes suddenly carried a different meaning. It was no longer evidence of limited success. It was evidence that every dollar had been invested where it mattered most. Michael then turned another page inside his folder. We would like to move into final negotiations, he said. Our intention is not to dismantle your company. We want your team to continue leading the products they built. We want your employees to remain. We want your clients to experience continuity rather than disruption. We are pursuing this acquisition because we believe the future of this business depends on preserving exactly what made it successful. I thanked him sincerely and told him that protecting my employees and clients remained my highest priority. If those priorities remain aligned, I said, then I believe we can continue the conversation. Michael smiled. That answer confirms why we made the right decision. After another round of discussions, the executives stood to leave. As we walked toward the front entrance, Michael noticed my father waiting nearby with the old computer. He extended his hand. You must be Ethan's father, he said warmly. I am Michael Donovan. My father introduced himself, still appearing slightly overwhelmed. Michael smiled respectfully before saying something I knew my father would remember for the rest of his life. You should be very proud of your son. We have spent months trying to understand how he built something this remarkable, and we are still learning from him. My father thanked him quietly, but for once he had no immediate reply. After the executives departed, we stood together in the reception area watching their vehicles disappear down the street. My father remained silent for several moments before finally turning toward me. The certainty that had always accompanied his opinions was gone, replaced by a thoughtful expression I had never seen before. In a calm voice that was almost a whisper, he asked the first question that truly mattered. Ethan, exactly what kind of company have you been building all these years? My father and I remained standing in the reception area long after the vehicles from Atlas Dynamics disappeared around the corner. He looked through the front windows without saying anything, as though he was trying to connect everything he had just witnessed with every opinion he had formed over the past several years. Finally, he looked at me and repeated his question. What kind of company have you really been building? I smiled because there was no longer any reason to avoid the conversation. The process had reached a point where secrecy no longer served a purpose between us. Come into my office, I said. We sat across from each other exactly where I had spent countless hours making decisions that shaped the business he had always believed was too small to matter. He slowly looked around the room again. It was still the same modest office with ordinary furniture, a whiteboard filled with handwritten notes, and family photographs resting on a bookshelf beside technical manuals. Nothing had changed except his perspective. I folded my hands together before speaking. The company started with 4 people and one goal, I said. We wanted to build software that organizations could depend on every single day. We never tried to become the biggest company. We tried to become the most trusted. My father listened quietly without interrupting. Whenever we had extra money, I continued, we invested it back into better engineers, stronger security, better customer support, and new technology. We could have moved into a larger office years ago, but I believed our clients would benefit more if we invested in the product instead of appearances. He slowly nodded. I always wondered why you never upgraded this place. Because this place already gave us everything we needed, I answered. The people inside it were always more important than the building itself. He remained silent for several moments before asking another question. How long have they been talking to you? Almost 2 months, I replied honestly. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. 2 months. I nodded. Their research actually started long before that. They spent months studying the company before they ever contacted me. He leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to process everything. And all this time you never told anyone. I smiled gently. Nothing had been decided. I did not want to celebrate possibilities. I only wanted to focus on running the business well. My father lowered his eyes for a moment. I guess I never understood what success looked like in your world. It looks different, I replied. Most of our best work happens where nobody can see it. He let out a quiet laugh before shaking his head. I spent years believing that if a company was truly valuable, everyone would know its name. Some companies become famous, I answered. Others become indispensable. He looked directly at me. Which one did you build? I tried to build the second kind. Before he could respond, Rachel knocked softly on the open office door. Sorry to interrupt, she said. Laura Bennett just sent over the preliminary framework for the final offer. Daniel Mercer is also on the conference call if you are available. I thanked her and explained that I would join in a few minutes. My father stood. I should probably get out of your way. You do not have to leave immediately, I said. You can stay in the break room if you would like. He smiled. I think I will. I would like to look around a little more. As I entered the conference room, Daniel Mercer appeared on the large monitor while Laura Bennett joined from Atlas Dynamics headquarters. She explained that after the chief executive officer's visit, the board had authorized them to move into final negotiations. She then reviewed the structure of their proposal. The financial terms were strong, but I paid far more attention to the sections concerning employees, leadership, and long-term operations. After she finished, I thanked her before speaking. There is one condition that matters more to me than the purchase price, I said. Every employee who helped build this company deserves stability. I will not agree to any transaction that results in unnecessary layoffs or dismantles the culture we spent years creating. Laura smiled. We expected you to say exactly that. Daniel looked at the revised documents before nodding with approval. Laura continued. Our board has already agreed that your entire team will remain in place. We are acquiring this company because of its people. Eliminating them would defeat the purpose. I felt a sense of relief that no number on the page could have provided. We continued discussing leadership responsibilities, product development plans, and customer commitments until every major issue had been addressed. By the time the meeting ended, we had reached a clear understanding. There were still legal details to finalize, but both sides were moving toward the same destination. As I stepped back into the hallway, I found my father standing near the development area watching several engineers collaborate around a large monitor. They were laughing while solving a complicated programming problem together. He looked at them for a long moment before turning toward me. They really enjoy working here, he said. They do, I answered. That is something I always wanted to protect. He nodded slowly. Now I understand why that man kept talking about your culture instead of your building. I smiled. Buildings can always be replaced. He looked around the office one final time before quietly saying something I had waited years to hear. I spent too much time judging what I could see instead of appreciating what you were quietly creating. I think I owe you an apology, and I hope I have the chance to earn it. 3 weeks later, the final agreements were signed in a quiet conference room overlooking the city skyline. There were no television cameras, no dramatic celebrations, and no speeches about changing the world. After months of careful conversations, legal reviews, and negotiations built on mutual respect, Atlas Dynamics officially acquired my company under terms that protected every employee, preserved our culture, and guaranteed continued support for every client who had trusted us over the years. As I placed my signature on the final document, I did not feel as though I was giving something away. Instead, I felt that I was giving the people who had built this company alongside me the opportunity to accomplish even more than we could have achieved alone. Michael Donovan shook my hand with the same calm professionalism he had shown from our very first meeting. Congratulations, Ethan, he said. Today is not the end of your company. It is the beginning of its next chapter. I thanked him sincerely because I knew those words reflected his genuine intentions. Over the following days, we announced the acquisition to our employees before anyone else. Every member of the team gathered in the conference room where I had spent years discussing software updates, customer feedback, and product ideas. I explained exactly why I had agreed to move forward and assured everyone that the commitments made during negotiations would be honored. No one would lose their position. Our leadership team would remain in place. Our clients would continue working with the same people they already knew and trusted. For a few moments, the room remained completely quiet. Then someone started applauding. Within seconds, the entire office joined in. Several employees smiled with visible relief, while others simply thanked me for protecting the culture we had spent so many years creating together. At that moment, I realized that the proudest achievement of my career was never the acquisition itself. It was earning the trust of people who believed I would always put them first. A few days later, my parents invited the entire family over for Sunday dinner. As I walked through the front door, everything looked familiar, yet something felt noticeably different. My father greeted me with a warm smile that carried none of the teasing confidence he had displayed for years. Instead, there was quiet respect in his eyes. Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed naturally from vacations to grandchildren, neighborhood projects, and holiday plans. For the first time in a long while, nobody joked about my business. Nobody asked when I planned to find a real job or move into a larger office. Eventually, my uncle looked toward my father and smiled. "Richard, I heard Ethan has been pretty busy lately." My father set down his fork before answering. "Busy is not the right word," he said. "He built something extraordinary." The entire table became quiet. My father turned toward me before continuing. "I spent years believing success had to be loud. I thought it needed a bigger building, more employees, expensive cars, and everyone talking about you. I was wrong." He looked around the table as though speaking to the entire family. "The most valuable company I have ever seen was sitting in a modest office with ordinary furniture because every extra dollar went into serving customers and taking care of employees instead of impressing strangers." No one interrupted him. "I used to tell Ethan that nobody would ever want to buy a company that small," he continued with a gentle smile. "The truth is that one of the largest technology companies in America wanted it because they recognized something I completely overlooked. They were not buying a building. They were investing in character." He looked back at me. "Son, I am proud of you, and I am sorry it took me so long to understand what you were actually building." I smiled because those words meant more to me than any headline announcing the acquisition ever could. "Thank you, Dad," I replied. "That is all I ever wanted you to understand." My mother quietly reached across the table and squeezed my hand. My sister smiled through tears she did not bother hiding. The conversation soon returned to ordinary family stories, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured. Respect had replaced assumptions, and understanding had replaced judgment. In the months that followed, very little about my personal life actually changed. I still drove the same pickup truck because it continued getting me wherever I needed to go. I still lived in the same townhouse because it still felt like home. I still arrived at the office early every morning because leadership had never depended on ownership papers. The only noticeable difference was that our team now had greater resources to serve more customers without sacrificing the values that had brought us there in the first place. Looking back, I sometimes think about that evening at my mother's birthday dinner when everyone laughed after my father called my company too small to matter. At the time, I could have argued. I could have listed clients, shared financial numbers, or tried to prove them wrong. Instead, I chose patience. Time has a remarkable way of revealing truths that words alone never can. I learned that real success does not demand applause before it deserves respect. It grows quietly through consistent decisions, honest work, fulfilled promises, and people who trust you enough to build something meaningful together. Those things rarely attract attention in the beginning, but when they are strong enough, the right people eventually notice. And when they do, you never have to convince anyone how valuable your work truly is, because the results speak with a voice far stronger than pride ever could.